There is a universally hilarious, um, almost infuriating human contradiction that I think we've all experienced at some point.
Oh, absolutely.
Imagine you're walking down the street, right, minding your own business. It's a beautiful day, you have a coffee in your hand, and you see a park bench.
Just a normal bench.
Exactly, just a regular, unremarkable wooden bench.
Hmm.
But resting on the back of it is a bright, bold, hand-painted sign that says, "Wet paint. Do not touch." What is the very first thing your brain screams at you to do?
You have this overwhelming urge to touch it. Like you feel like you absolutely have to tap it with just one finger, just to check.
Yes, it becomes literally the only thing in the world you want to do. I mean, before you saw that sign, you could have cared less about the bench. You were just going to walk right past it.
Right.
But the exact moment you are explicitly told not to do something,
Mm-hmm.
it suddenly transforms into this burning, irresistible desire. And on paper, it makes absolutely no sense.
It completely defies logic. But that compulsion to touch the wet paint is actually one of the most predictable, deeply ingrained behavioral reflexes we possess as human beings. It is a fundamental part of our wiring.
And that reflex is exactly what we're exploring today. So welcome to our deep dive. I'm your host. And our mission today is to unpack a massive, fascinating stack of research, historical data, and cultural artifacts that you've shared with us as our resident expert.
Thanks for having me.
We're trying to understand the invisible psychological engine behind what we, commonly call reverse psychology. We're pulling together everything from 50-year reviews of clinical psychology to modern marketing analyses and even parenting guides.
Because we really need to establish right up front that we aren't just talking about like clever little playground tricks here,
Right.
or how to manipulate your friends. When you really look at the behavioral science, this is a profound conversation about the fundamental human desire for freedom.
Wow.
Yeah, over the course of this deep dive, we're going to examine how that fierce desire to be in control can be used to heal deep trauma in a clinical setting, how it can be hacked by the people in our everyday lives, and how it is monetized at a massive global scale.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can figure out how reverse psychology is actually used out in the wild, we have to look under the hood at the biological and psychological engine that makes it work in the first place.
We do.
And to do that, we have to go back to 1966. A psychologist named Jack Brem introduced a concept called psychological reactance theory, or PRT. And this really sets the stage for everything else, right?
It does. I mean, Brem's theory is the absolute bedrock of this entire phenomenon. Psychological reactance theory is built on two very simple but incredibly powerful assumptions about how we navigate the world.
Okay.
The first assumption is that people walk around every day believing they possess a specific set of free behaviors. You believe, down to your core, that you can choose what to eat for lunch, where to sit on the bus, what opinions to hold.
Right. It's our baseline assumption of autonomy. Like, I am in charge of me.
Exactly. And the second assumption is where the friction happens. Whenever those perceived freedoms are eliminated, or even just threatened, it triggers this intense motivational state.
Like a threat response.
Yeah, your brain basically sounds a high alert alarm, and you become highly motivated to restore that lost freedom by any means necessary. Psychologists refer to this reaction as the boomerang effect.
So if I casually tell you that you absolutely cannot have a glass of water, the boomerang comes swinging back, and suddenly you will fight me tooth and nail for that water, even if you weren't thirsty 2 minutes ago.
Precisely.
If we think about human behavioral freedom, it's almost like a physical reflex. I mean, imagine you're sitting on an exam table and a doctor taps your knee with that little rubber hammer.
The knee jerk.
Right. Your leg kicks out entirely on its own. You don't
Yeah.
think about it, you don't plan it. It seems like our psychology operates the exact same way. When a freedom is pinned down or restricted, our psychological knee jerks back automatically.
What's fascinating here is the underlying mechanism that drives that kick. Like, why does it happen so automatically?
Yeah, why?
It's deeply tied to a concept called cognitive dissonance. When someone threatens your freedom, it creates a profound, almost physical mental discomfort. Your brain is holding two conflicting realities. One is, I am a free, independent person, and the other is, this external force is currently controlling me.
And those two just cannot exist in the same space.
Exactly. They cannot coexist peacefully. And the research shows something incredible about how we resolve that dissonance. We don't necessarily even desire the specific freedom that was taken away.
Like touching the wet paint.
Right. What we fiercely, violently hate is the loss of control. We have a baseline autonomy bias. We just need to be the authors of our own destiny.
I'm curious about the scale of this, though, because obviously we follow rules every day. I mean, we stop at red lights, we pay for our groceries, so there have to be specific variables that dictate just how hard that psychological knee is going to jerk back.
You're entirely right, and the severity of the threat absolutely dictates the scale of the response. The more intense or aggressive the restriction, the harder the pushback.
Makes sense.
Think about the tone of a sign on a lawn. If a sign says, "Please consider staying off the newly planted grass," you might respect it. Your autonomy is acknowledged.
Sure.
But if that exact same lawn has a sign that says, "Absolutely no walking on the grass under penalty of law, do not even think about it," you might feel a sudden, intense urge to step on a blade of grass just to prove that you can.
That makes total sense. The harder you push, the harder I push back.
Yeah.
But what really blew my mind, reading through the background material, was this phenomenon called vicarious reactance.
Yes, the research by Sittenthaler and colleagues on this is just remarkable.
It really is. It turns out the threat doesn't even have to be directed at you to trigger your defenses. Simply watching or reading about someone else's freedom getting restricted is enough to cause an immediate spike in your own physiological stress and anger.
It's a highly empathetic response.
Right. Imagine you're sitting in a coffee shop and you watch a manager aggressively berating a barista, telling them they aren't allowed to take a water break. The manager isn't talking to you. Your water break isn't threatened. But your heart rate elevates anyway.
You experience that cognitive dissonance and reactance on their behalf.
Which tells us that our need for autonomy isn't just a selfish trait. It is a deeply empathetic, highly socialized reflex. We recognize the restriction of freedom as a universal threat.
Absolutely.
So if our brains are so aggressively hardwired to push back against a loss of control, it makes me wonder if we can weaponize that reflex for good. Like if the brain automatically rebels against a restriction, can we use that defiance to actually fix a broken psychological state?
We absolutely can. And that brings us from the realm of behavioral theory into the realm of clinical therapy.
Okay, tell me about that.
Well, clinical giants in the mid-20th century, most notably Viktor Frankl and Milton Erickson, pioneered exactly what you're describing. They began using a technique known as paradoxical interventions. In the simplest terms, a paradoxical intervention means prescribing the symptom.
Prescribing the symptom. So instead of trying to cure the problem directly, the therapist tells the patient to go out and actively perform the very behavior that is causing them distress.
Correct. Let's look at how this works with sleep disorders, specifically onset insomnia, which is the inability to fall asleep at the beginning of the night.
I think a lot of people listening can probably relate to that one.
Oh, definitely. Normally, a well-meaning doctor would tell the patient to drink some warm tea, practice deep breathing, and try their hardest to relax and fall asleep. But a therapist using a paradoxical intervention flips the entire script.
What do?
They tell a patient, your homework tonight is to go to bed, keep your eyes open, and try to stay awake for as long as humanly possible.
And the clinical trials show that this actually works. Patients who are told to stay awake end up falling asleep faster. But to understand why that works, we have to look at the mechanics of what is actually keeping them awake in the first place, which is something called recursive anxiety.
Precisely. Recursive anxiety is essentially the fear of fear itself. The patient is lying in bed, intensely anxious about the fact that they aren't sleeping. They're watching the clock, thinking about how exhausted they will be tomorrow.
And that just floods their system.
Exactly. That very performance anxiety about falling asleep is the exact mechanism keeping their brain flooded with adrenaline and keeping them awake. It's a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. But the moment the therapist says, I want you to deliberately stay awake, the pressure to fall asleep completely vanishes.
Because now the goal has changed. They're trying to stay awake, which is exhausting in a dark, quiet room. And because that crushing performance anxiety is suddenly gone, their body's natural fatigue takes over, and they end up falling asleep naturally.
Exactly. The paradox breaks the cycle. However, there is a very strict limitation to this technique. It works wonders for onset insomnia, but it completely fails for intermittent insomnia.
Which is when a person wakes up repeatedly in the middle of the night and can't get back to sleep.
Right.
Why is that, though? What's the mechanical difference between the two?
It comes down to voluntary control. A paradoxical intervention requires the patient to be able to voluntarily perform the symptom. You can voluntarily try to stay awake at 10 p.m., But you cannot voluntarily wake yourself up from a deep sleep at 3 a.m.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, if the symptom isn't something the patient can actively attempt to control, the intervention falls flat because there is no way to prescribe it as a conscious action.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, and I want to push back on this whole concept a little bit.
Go for it.
If a trained, licensed therapist is sitting across from a vulnerable patient in a clinical setting, and they essentially trick that patient into doing the very thing that is hurting them just to trigger a reverse reaction, isn't that just defiance-based manipulation? Like, how is tricking someone ethically sound in a medical environment?
It is a critical question, and it's one that psychologists have debated extensively. But the distinction lies in the clinical nuance between defiance and compliance.
Okay.
The goal isn't to trick the patient into rebelling against the therapist. It's actually a compliance-based strategy. By asking the patient to voluntarily perform the involuntary symptom, the therapist is helping them transfer control back to themselves.
Wait, can you give me an example of that?
Sure, think about it like this. If you suffer from panic attacks, the terrifying part is that the panic controls you. If a therapist tells you to try and schedule a panic attack for 2 p.m. on Tuesday, and you realize you can't do it on command, you suddenly realize the symptom doesn't have absolute power over you. Gaining control over sensations that were previously beyond your control is a deeply empowering feeling. It extinguishes the psychological power of the symptom.
Okay, that makes sense. In a controlled clinical setting, with a professional whose sole aim is to empower the patient, it's a therapeutic tool used to restore a sense of agency. But giving a patient control over their symptoms in a safe space is one thing.
Right.
What happens when everyday people, parents, teachers, spouses, managers, try to wield this highly potent psychological tool in their daily lives to get what they want?
That takes us into much more volatile territory. When you move reverse psychology out of the clinic and into interpersonal communication, particularly in parenting, the stakes change dramatically and the potential for damage increases.
There is a classic toddler experiment that illustrates just how tempting it is to use this. Researchers put a group of kids in a room full of ordinary toys. They casually mentioned that one specific toy was strictly off-limits.
And we know what happened next.
Unsurprisingly, within minutes, that restricted toy became the single most desired object in the entire room. All the kids fought over it. It is pure, unadulterated reactance. So naturally, parents observe this behavior and realize they can weaponize it.
They do, and often they do it completely subconsciously. Parents use a variety of reverse psychology tactics just to survive the day.
I mean, parenting is hard.
It is, and sometimes it involves belittling a habit.
Yeah.
A parent might look at a plate of vegetables and say, ugh, eating broccoli is gross, I bet you couldn't eat it, hoping the child eats it purely to prove them wrong.
Right.
Other times, they might discourage a desired action, like telling a teenager not to bother cleaning their room because they probably wouldn't do a thorough job anyway. Or they explicitly doubt the child's ability, like, I sincerely doubt you can finish your homework before dinner.
So what does this all mean? If it gets the kid to eat the broccoli or clean the room, is it a win? Thinking about it, using reverse psychology in a personal relationship is a lot like using a cheat code in a video game.
I like that analogy.
It might help you bypass one really frustrating, difficult level like getting a stubborn toddler to put their shoes on so you aren't late for work. But if you keep relying on that cheat code over and over again, eventually you corrupt the save file. You break the actual mechanics of the game. And in a relationship, the core mechanic is mutual trust.
That is a brilliant analogy. And it aligns perfectly with the stark warnings from leading relationship researchers like psychology professor John Gottman.
What does he say about it?
He strongly advises against using these strategies, especially as children grow into teenagers. He points out that these tactics are inherently confusing, manipulative, and fundamentally dishonest.
That makes sense.
When you say the exact opposite of what you actually mean, you are actively corroding clear communication. You are training the other person that your words cannot be trusted at face value.
And there is a much heavier risk here, especially for children who might have low self-esteem. I mean, a naturally confident, defiant kid might hear, I bet you can't eat this broccoli, and say, watch me. But a child who struggles with confidence, who relies heavily on their parents to form their own self-image, might react very differently. If a parent constantly says, I doubt you can finish this, or you probably can't do that, the child might not rebel. They might just internalize that judgment.
Exactly. They might accept the parent's statement as truth and say, you're right, I can't do it, which is just devastating.
It really is.
It's entirely counterproductive to their development. That's why behavioral experts strongly advocate for smarter, more transparent alternatives. Instead of tricking someone into compliance, you can feed their fundamental need for autonomy in a genuine way.
How do you do that?
The most effective way is by offering choices. Instead of demanding, put your shoes on right now, which triggers reactance, you ask, do you want to put your red shoes on or your blue shoes on?
Oh, that's smart.
The outcome wearing shoes is still achieved, but the child gets to exercise control over the how. It satisfies their autonomy bias without deception. You can also use empathy to de-escalate. Simply acknowledging why someone is resisting, saying, I know you really don't want to start playing right now, it's frustrating, often diffuses the reactance because they feel heard and respected rather than controlled.
So parents and partners really have to tread carefully so they don't break that foundational trust. They have to put the cheat code away.
Very true.
But while individuals have to be careful, it seems like marketers and corporate storytellers have looked at the psychological cheat code and decided to fully embrace it. They're using it to capture our attention at a massive scale, essentially turning our fierce need for independence into revenue.
They absolutely are, and it has completely transformed the advertising industry. Marketing has had to evolve from aggressive, in-your-face persuasion to something much more subtle and paradoxical.
Because of that autonomy bias.
Yes, because of that autonomy bias we've been discussing. Our deep, instinctual need to feel independent and uncoerced modern consumers are highly resistant to traditional advertising. The moment we feel like we are being sold to, our psychological knee-jerks, and we tune out. So, brands use reverse psychology to bypass our defenses entirely.
Looking at how brands actually use this in the real world is brilliant. You have a company like Patagonia running a massive full-page ad on Black Friday that literally says, don't buy this jacket.
It's iconic.
It completely stops you in your tracks. By explicitly telling you not to buy their product, they signal that they value purpose, sustainability, and anti-consumerism over pure profit. That creates a massive amount of trust and ironically makes you want to buy from them even more to support their ethos.
It completely disarms the consumer's reactance. And then you have highly aggressive, ironic campaigns like Liquid Death, a canned water company that tells people to murder your thirst and actively insults its own customer base, jokingly calling them psychos.
I've seen those ads.
And Cards Against Humanity took this to the absolute extreme. One Black Friday, they ran a promotion telling people to pay them $5 and receive absolutely nothing in return. They explicitly said, do not expect a product. You are just giving us money.
And people eagerly gave them tens of thousands of dollars. It's just wild. Why does that work?
It taps right back into that cognitive dissonance. When a brand tells you not to like them or demands you give them money for nothing, it creates mental friction. It is so unexpected that it sparks intense curiosity. It makes the consumer feel like they are in on a joke rather than being the target of a sales pitch.
That makes a lot of sense.
There is also an even more nuanced application of this. It's the concept of secret brands. The author, William Gibson, explores this beautifully in his novel Zero History with the fictional brand Gabriel Hounds. The entire selling point of the brand is its heavily restricted availability. There are no retail outlets, no catalogs, no advertising. It is almost impossible to find.
Because if it's incredibly hard to get, our freedom to easily possess it is threatened. The restriction itself creates the demand. We want it precisely because we're subtly being told we probably can't have it.
Exactly.
But marketers can't always rely on irony or secrecy. Sometimes they have to make a direct ask. And there's a fascinating tactic they use to avoid triggering our reactance when they do have to be direct. It's called a restoration postscript.
Yes, this is a highly effective linguistic tool. If a message is highly demanding, for example, a charity campaign telling you that you absolutely must donate today to save a life, it naturally generates pressure.
And pressure triggers anger and reactance in the listener.
Right. But if the marketer simply adds a small postscript at the very end of the pitch that says, but of course, the choice is entirely yours, you are completely free to decide for yourself, it almost entirely neutralizes the audience's anger.
Going back to our video game analogy, if using reverse psychology is the cheat code, the restoration postscript is the software patch that keeps the game from crashing. It allows the marketer to make a heavy demand without breaking the trust.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is exactly why it works so incredibly well. It gives the consumer the illusion of opting in. It respects their autonomy on the surface. By constantly reinforcing that you are in control, It makes people feel like they aren't being forced, even as they pull out their credit cards and comply with the demand.
It creates the feeling of a voluntary dialogue rather than a forced pitch. And we see this exact same behavioral manipulation outside of commerce, deeply embedded in our historical pop culture. I was laughing reading through the historical examples because modern corporate marketing executives are essentially using the exact same psychological playbook as a cartoon rabbit.
Thanks, Bunny.
Yes. Think about Bugs Bunny arguing with Daffy Duck. Daffy is screaming, "Duck season!" and Bugs is yelling, "Rabbit season!" Bugs just suddenly switches his tactic and calmly says, "Rabbit season." Daffy, completely blinded by his own reactance and his desperate need to disagree with Bugs, immediately demands "Duck season, fire," and gets himself shot.
It's a classic comedic trope, but it endures because it is rooted in very real, observable psychology. Mark Twain famously used the exact same mechanism in literature when Tom Sawyer tricked his friends into whitewashing a fence.
Oh, right.
He didn't ask them for help. He framed the grueling chore as an exclusive artistic privilege that they weren't qualified for. Their reactance made them beg to do his chores. And we see it in the music industry, too. When Queen recorded Bohemian Rhapsody, radio executives told them it was way too long to ever get airplay. So the band gave the track to a popular DJ, Kenny Everett, and explicitly made him promise not to play it on the radio.
Which, of course, absolutely guaranteed that he would play it on the radio. He teased his audience with it, played snippets, and then played the whole thing. It shot to #1 for 9 weeks.
It's genius.
But perhaps the most brilliant pop culture application of this is the Florida Truth anti-tobacco campaign from the late 90s and early 2000s.
That campaign was a masterclass in redirecting psychological reactance. Historically, health authorities and parents simply told teenagers, "Don't smoke, it's bad for you." But as we know, telling a teenager not to do something just triggers their rebellion, inadvertently making smoking seem edgy and cool.
Right, the parent becomes a restrictive force, so smoking becomes the symbol of freedom. But the Truth campaign completely flipped the script. Instead of lecturing the teens, they framed the cigarette itself and the tobacco executives as an overweight, controlling bully trying to dictate what teenagers do to their bodies.
They took the natural adolescent need to rebel and aimed it squarely at the product. To be rebellious was no longer to smoke. To be rebellious was to actively reject the cigarette's attempt to control you. It used their own autonomy bias to save their lives.
It is so incredibly clever. So bringing this all back to you listening right now, whether you are trying to raise a stubborn toddler without losing your mind, negotiating a high-stakes conflict at work, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to fall asleep, or just mindlessly scrolling through targeted ads on your phone, your fierce subconscious need to protect your own freedom is the invisible hand steering the ship. Your brain is constantly scanning your environment for threats to your autonomy, and it is jerking that psychological knee whenever it feels boxed in.
And understanding that reflex gives you an immense amount of clarity. It allows you to pause and recognize when you are making a choice out of genuine desire versus when you are reacting purely out of spite simply because someone or something told you no.
It forces you to ask, who is really in the driver's seat? And as we wrap up this deep dive, that idea of control brings to mind something much more insidious.
Yeah, this part is pretty dark.
We've been talking about how we react to overt restrictions. A sign telling us what to do, a parent giving an order, an ad asking for money. But there is a much quieter, deeper manipulation at play. The philosophers Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer proposed a concept that totally shifts how we look at this. They analyzed mass media and what they called the culture industry, and they described its primary function as psychoanalysis in reverse.
Their argument is that mass culture doesn't just respond to our desires, it deliberately manufactures feelings of profound inadequacy in order to drive our behavior.
Exactly. Look at the 1970s. The jogging boom starts as this wonderful organic movement of body acceptance. The idea was that you didn't have to be a massive bodybuilder in a sweaty, exclusive gym to be healthy. You could just put on some cheap sneakers, go outside and run. It was liberating.
Right, it was totally free.
But the culture industry sees this uncontrolled, free behavior, co-opts it, and responds with massive, inescapable ad campaigns featuring exceptionally toned, physically flawless Calvin Klein models.
Suddenly, ordinary people who are perfectly happy running around their neighborhoods are comparing themselves to these mathematically impossible standards. It creates intense body shame and feelings of inadequacy where absolute none existed before.
The industry essentially manufactures a profound psychological deficit. They create a feeling of being less than, just so they can sell you the expensive activewear, the diet plans, and the gym memberships that promise to fix the very insecurity they invented. They induce a state of deep dissatisfaction with your current reality, so you feel compelled to buy your way into an idealized one.
It is the ultimate circumvention of psychological reactance. You don't rebel against the control because you don't even realize you are being controlled. You think you are simply trying to better yourself.
So as you go about your day, think about the choices you make, the products you buy, and the rebellions you champion. Are the personal freedoms and the deep desires you think you are so fiercely protecting actually your own? Or were they secretly, carefully manufactured for you by the very culture you think you are rebelling against?